having real conversations with people and not just reading from scripts, I think would make a huge difference in how connected people feel to politics.
I'm Eric Wilson, Managing Partner of Startup Caucus, an investment fund and incubator for campaign technology. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, we bring you into conversation with the entrepreneurs who build best-in-class political businesses, the funders who provide the capital, and the operatives who put it all together to win campaigns. Today, we've got a very special guest. We're joined by Daniel Laurison. He's an associate professor of sociology at Swarthmore College, the associate editor of the British Journal of Sociology, and a Carnegie Fellow. He researches and writes on social class and political inequality. He's out with a great new book that I've really enjoyed reading called Producing Politics: Inside the Exclusive Campaign World Where the Privileged Few Shape Politics for All of Us. We talk about his own campaign experiences, what he learned from his research, and how campaigns can become more effective organizations. Daniel, you begin your book with a story I've heard many times before from technologists and entrepreneurs that I work with via Startup Caucus who are frustrated that campaigns don't make full use of their talents. Share that story with our listeners. And I'm curious to hear what you've learned after your research about why that may have happened.
Sure. So in 2004, I was just starting grad school in Berkeley. I worked at a small nonprofit in Philadelphia for about 5 years before going to grad school. And it was the Bush-Kerry campaign. And I thought, I wanted Kerry to win. And I had a lot of skills from working in a small nonprofit. I knew how to organize events. I knew how to manage volunteers and recruit them. I'd done fundraising. I'd done, from my perspective, pretty much everything that, every kind of skill you might need to be at least moderately helpful to a campaign organization. So I went down to the Kerry office and said hello, and I'm available, and what do you need from me? And as anyone in this world will know, they said, great, welcome, thank you so much. Here's a list of people to call. There's a chair. Off you go. And I want to be clear that I think that's important and effective, and it's a key role for volunteers to play. But there was nothing else available, right? So I did that to the best of my ability. I went to Nevada. I did, all the things that they had volunteers doing. But then I wanted to be more involved, both because, again, I thought I had something to offer, but also because I wanted to sort of understand the inside of the world of politics a little bit. And so in 2006, I found a contested House race not too far from me. And a
contested House race not too far from Berkeley. That must have been a good year for Republicans.
It was over the hills in anyway, I'm blanking on the guy's name at the moment, but it was a Democrat actually taking over a seat from a longtime Republican incumbent.
Bad year for him.
But anyway, I went over there. I showed up. I said I could give you, hours every week. What can I do? And I blew up some balloons one time, and then again, did phone calls and canvassing. I had that experience again early in 2008 with the same campaign where I said, now I just have this job 4 hours a day, 4 days a week. Other than that, I could give you all of the time I've got. And I'm thinking I'm offering like 20, 25 hours a week of free labor. They've got to take me this time. And they said, if you've got 60 hours a week and you can quit that other job you have, great, welcome aboard. Otherwise, there's nothing we could do with you. And I finally actually got involved in a campaign later that summer of 2008 because someone I knew from grad school was involved with the local Obama organization. And as they were staffing up, I had spent a fair amount of time being there as often as I could. And she sort of knew me a little bit and chose me as one of the people to be one of the actual full-time, unpaid, but full-time sort of semi-staff people in the Berkeley, Oakland Obama office. So, and then the other thing I recount in the book is that once I was in that role, when volunteers came in and said, "I've got so many skills," we all just sort of went, "Ha ha ha! Yeah, we know. Go make some phone
Right.
calls." So we did the exact same
It's
thing
part of your
back to
training.
people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of your training. And I mean, part of it is there, the bulk of what is the way campaigns are set up. Even the Obama organization in 2008, which was much more invested in letting people have some control over being part of the campaign. It let people organize their own house parties, get their own lists for canvassing, that sort of thing. Part of it is that just a lot of what needs to happen is contacting voters, and that's really important. But part of it is that people who get a little taste of that political power, that sort of being in the room where it happens, as as Hamilton says, and as one of my interviewees said, want to keep it for themselves. And I think that's part of the dynamic that's going on that keeps regular people from being able to contribute as much as they might like to.
Yeah. And I think another thing that I have seen is the trust that comes with it, right? And giving people access to data, yes, but also the exposure that comes with, because, I've been on campaigns where we had to deal with some volunteer who changed their Twitter bio to say that they worked for our campaign, then says something untoward. We now have a problem, right? So like this was a big challenge for me on the Rubio campaign in 2016. We had this massive social media volunteer base, and we wanted to take full advantage of them. But the entire time I was convincing people inside the campaign that, no, we don't want to shut this down. We don't want to tell them to stop doing what they're doing. They're giving us hours of their day. And so I think about Lee Atwater said that the mark of a truly great campaign is the ability to absorb infinite numbers of people. And you diagnose that as a real blind spot for a lot of campaigns.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, a lot of people in campaigns believe, and I'm not sure it's entirely true, that one of the most important things is to have a control over the message, right? To have a single sort of line that's going out about what this campaign is about, and to reinforce that over and over. And if you let other people in, then they might say things that aren't what you would say, what the campaign wants to put out there. And so I think that, I both understand why people want to have control, and I don't think it's unreasonable in some cases. And I think it, again, gets in the way of fully involving more people.
And you, to that end, you write that contemporary campaigns tend to be performances more than conversations. Each campaign is conceived and executed as an isolated event rather than part of an ongoing party project. What do you think are the root causes for that disconnect?
I mean, one thing is, I think, a lot of the people who work in campaigns are people who work in politics more generally, are people, the comparison I often make is that it's like a kid who's been a hardcore baseball fanatic since the time they could walk, and they get to play pro baseball. And they're, what you're interested in when you're playing pro baseball, so far as I can tell, not being a baseball person myself, right, is what's happening on the other team, what's happening on the field. That's where all of your sort of concentration is. And I think, politics is especially difficult in that way, because it's also really hard to tell whether any given thing that a campaign does is what necessarily is making the difference. So, you can look at whether polls are shifting, et cetera, but at the end of the day, it's really challenging to figure that out. And so what you can see right away is, do the people around me think this ad I made was cool? Is it getting media attention?
The retweets,
is the other side reacting one way or another? Right. The retweets, the hits on, and, to some extent hits on YouTube or retweets or et cetera are some indication of people actually engaging. But a lot of it is really just the reactions from other people in politics. And so that makes it hard to focus on the people outside, and it is hard to get a sense of what's going on for the millions of people in this country. So again, it's not that I think it comes out of something necessarily nefarious, but it does have negative effects.
Daniel, the book is based on your interviews with campaign operatives. I'm curious to hear, what are some of the surprising things that you learned from them that you didn't already know going into this project?
One thing was, I was surprised by how willing people were to tell me what's wrong with the campaign world. A lot of people had real critiques of the culture of, one thing we is that a lot, you tweeted this, that's why I'm thinking of it, right? That that the relationship between the best evidence we have about what's effective and what campaigns actually do is not perfect or linear in any way. And so they were willing to make those critiques, and they were also willing to acknowledge the thing I just said a minute ago, which is that it is really hard to know what's working, what's effective, how much difference you make, whether you're making a difference at all. And so a lot of what people in campaigns end up doing is based on either conventional wisdom from people around them or just sort of a gut sense of what's going to work or who can argue the loudest or has the sharpest elbows. And that was something that a lot of people were really concerned about.
That is fascinating. I'm thinking back to this is like the finishing weeks of the 2016 campaign. There was an anecdote about how Trump's campaign was planning his travel strategy based on the like build your own electoral college map, right? That was what is that was at least what was reported. And then someone from the Clinton campaign tweeted, "Needless to say, this is not how we plan our strategy." And so it really reveals that, I mean, I think a lot of political operatives are critical. They know that the industry could be done better, but there are two things kind of holding them back. One is the business models, right? The way you earn a living in politics is by doing the things that people will pay you for, right? So there's sort of that market pressure. And then also the campaigns, as you discuss, aren't necessarily for the voters. They're for funders, candidates, party committee. They're the operatives, the people producing politics are doing it for a different customer, right? And so I think those are two things that I saw come out in your interviews.
Yeah, I mean, one person said to me, about sort of the idea of doing something that was different or unusual or not what everyone else expected. He said, I suppose you could stick your neck out that way, and if you win doing that, you'll probably be okay. But if you lose, you're going to be out of the circle. Right? You're going to be that guy who tried something weird or that other people didn't think would work, or that made life harder for the other folks in one way or another, and no one's going to want to work with you again. And a huge part of how people get jobs in campaigns, and this is true in lots of other fields as well, but I think it's more true than average in campaign world. A lot of how people get jobs, almost entirely how people get jobs, is someone else knows you and thinks you're good and offers to bring you on, right? And so if you are making enemies because you are arguing that, the ad guys should not actually get that much money this cycle, we need to put more money into something else, or if you're, insisting on, making a big thing about, I had someone with a candidate who was unusual in some way and they wanted to address it head on. And the rest of the campaign just thought that was too much of a risk. So again, if you sort of stick your neck out and insist on doing something everybody else thinks is too risky, they're not going to necessarily want to work with you again. So there's a big incentive to sort of stick with what everybody else believes is the right thing, even if everybody, or at least some substantial portion of people, are secretly thinking it's not the right thing either.
I think there are two things converging here, right? Which there's you cite a lot of research in one of your early chapters about campaigns don't necessarily matter, right? I think someone summed it up really well. It's like campaigns don't matter until they do, which I think is like the right attitude here. But so if we take that of campaigns typically don't matter, but we can't take risks because it might screw it up. That's a really hard circle to square, I guess. You rightly call out that because politics, professional politics, that is a lot of who you know, that tends to mean who you are, right? So people that went to colleges like you, that came from similar backgrounds like you, Uh, Startup Caucus is working with two companies that are trying to address this challenge. One is GOP Jobs, which is a jobs board, right? You point this out in your book. Most jobs are not publicly posted on campaigns. And
Right.
GOP Jobs is one of the only jobs boards I know that frequently does not tell you what job you're applying for, right? It just gives you kind of anonymous information. And then Revered Work, which is helping people build a more stable career, right? Because unless you have, family resources, it's hard to go unemployed for weeks
Right.
or months at a time. And so we're looking at this, and we take the view that, like the success that we've seen in candidate recruitment of recruiting candidates who are more reflective of the districts they seek to serve, we need campaigns to look like that too. I'm curious to hear what other recommendations you have for practitioners on opening the industry to new professionals.
Yeah, I think those sound like great initiatives. I think the other big thing that could be done is really rethinking what the entry level or sort of starter jobs look like in the first place, right? So you mentioned if you don't have a lot of income, it's hard to go unemployed. It's also hard to go to take a job that you
Mm-hmm.
don't know when it will end, that you might have to move for, that pays you often. I mean, often the first time people work for a campaign, they do it for free or they do it for very, 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 very little money and no job security. So I think rethinking how that works. I mean, the other thing that most national campaigns tend to do is hire people from DC or from anywhere in the country to work anywhere else in the country. And so that means requiring people to move to get there,
Mm-hmm.
for these early jobs. I think hiring more people who live in the places that the campaigns are
Right.
happening would make sense, and paying them better. And this is going to be a hard one for campaign culture to accept, but I think if we want a sustainable politics industry that actually connects regular people to politics, it probably needs to happen, is figuring out how to not make it a job that's 100 hours a week, for the during the last month of the campaign, and 70 hours a week or whatever it is, before that, trying to make it a job that you can have and also have a family
Right.
also. One of the people I interviewed described the American Association of Political Consultants conference as a bunch of really sad divorced old white guys. um, which that he said, please don't attribute that to me. And obviously, lots of people
I'll be
figure out
speaking
how
to
to
the
have.
AAPC later this week. So, yeah.
Right, tell them I said that. No, but I think lots of people figure out how to have a relatively healthy family life despite the ways that campaigns make that
Mm-hmm.
difficult. But it's really hard, and probably requires having a spouse with a lot more flexibility
Mm-hmm.
and a lot less of a work commitment than the person on the
Well,
campaign.
when I was reading this chapter of your book, the thing that I kept going back to is, I'm a big believer of the lean startup methodology, right? Which the idea for a company is you get the minimum viable product and you just get along as best you can. The big criticism of that is it doesn't allow room for things like diversity, putting ethics and more, like there are just a lot of things that get sacrificed when you're running lean. And same thing goes for campaigns. And it's just fascinating when you start to dig into this stuff. There's so many unintended consequences. So when you look at a campaign that has hard, at the federal level, those restrictions on how much an individual can give, who can give, and then there's time constraints. So campaigns are necessarily restrained by time and resources, and so you have to chip away at, well, what's essential. I don't think people are saying, oh, I'm going to exclude this type of person. It's, I need someone who can get here tomorrow that I already know and trust, and so I'm just going to go to my own network. Right. I don't think it's intentional. So again, I don't know what the policy change is. Maybe, put more money into politics, or more specifically, put more money into campaigns, right? Which would be the distinction there. So it was just a fascinating perspective.
I mean, I think one solution is maybe not at the campaign level, but at the party and affiliated
Mm.
organization level, right? Because those are institutions that and the 501c4s that could accept unlimited money from practically
Right.
anybody, right? Those sorts of organizations could hire people to work for them year round who live in the places they're going to be campaigning, who can give them job security, can do all of that. Of course, there's still fluctuations in the cycle in terms of how much money is coming in right now versus how much money is going to be coming in 6 months from now. But I think it would be possible for those sorts of organizations to do that, and to the extent allowed by the law, that's always a little complicated, but to coordinate with the campaigns, or to otherwise, have people at least get their starts in those kind of
right, kind of a launching pad. You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Daniel Laurison, author of Producing Politics. Daniel, you write about how political operatives think and work, and I'm left with the sense that you're frustrated by the lack of a peer review process like you'd see in academia, or even like a business metrics effectiveness culture that you'd see in commercial endeavors. I want to get you to say something nice about our listeners. So what talent, skills, or insights do you think successful or effective political operatives possess?
Almost everybody I talked to, I really enjoyed speaking with, and I really respect a lot, right? So I tried to be I have a real critique. I have a lot of things that I want to be different. But I also really respected almost everyone I spoke with. There were a few exceptions. And one of the things that, a lot of critiques of the campaign industry that come from outside say you all are mercenaries, you don't care, you're just trying to get as much money as you can. And for most people I talk with, that really wasn't true. One person I spoke with said they could make much more money working in commercial polling instead of in political polling. But he said, I just don't care at all whether the toothpaste box is red or green. It just doesn't make a difference at all. But it makes a whale of a difference who's president. Right. So pretty much everyone I spoke to, again, there are a few exceptions, but pretty much everyone I spoke to really believes in the values of their party and really wants to see that party succeed. And they're doing this partly because they love the thrill, partly because the access to power is intoxicating, partly because, it's just something they've, for a lot of people, been sort of a geeky fan of for a long time. But also because they really believe in it. And I think that's important to remember. You're also a set of people with amazing social skills, I will say. Like
no one has ever said that about me.
Or at least really good, in an interview, one-on-one conversational skills. Also, I'm comparing to academics.
Okay, the bar is pretty low. One of the things that we talk about with, obviously, there's kind of that professional layer of they want to win and then move on to the next campaign. But of course, at their core, campaigns are, of course, about winning elected office. And there's a saying that governing is campaigning by different means. How do we see this campaign world spill over into other areas of government?
I mean, I think a lot of it is that we see in government more, I think, than was probably the case 50, 75 years ago when politics was less professionalized, that a lot of it is, although I'm not a historian, so I should sort of put a little star by that. This is my guess, right? But certainly it's the case that there's a lot of how governing works that ends up looking just like how campaigning works, as you said, especially I think with regard to the approach that is like, can I score a point against the other side? Can I, sort of the focus on the competition more than even when something is passed, communicating to regular people, look at this cool thing we've done. So I think that's part of it. I think also just the way of thinking about voters and the electorate as sort of, a conglomeration of variables, essentially.
Well, you called it a terrain to be conquered. I thought that was a great image, and I'm trying to be more conscious about that in my own discussions.
Yeah, that way of thinking about the population of the country you're representing, I think often creeps into how governing gets done, how politics works, even among elected officials. Again, I don't think it's because people don't care about the things they're trying to do for the country, but it works out that you get this approach that fails to connect with people.
Yeah, it reminds me of a conversation I had recently with someone who works for an advocacy organization that's trying to advance a policy. And they said to me, Well, our concern is if everyone agrees on it, that raises red flags
Hmm.
because and it's that political thinking that's creeped in.
Right. If both sides could actually vote for it, then it's not winning any points for one side or the
Right.
other.
Then why do it? No. Yeah. So Daniel, I'm going to try and make my best defense for the professional political world by
Sure.
saying that we are also driven by outside forces and are
Hmm.
in responding to market pressure. There are funders who have preconceived notions about what the campaign should be about. They know a lot about business, so they're going to tell us how to run campaigns, even though we read the academic literature that says that's not effective. You've got candidates who, no matter how qualified or good they are, there is an ego involved. Their name is on that ballot, and they're going to have to go see their friends at church or school or what have you at the end of the campaign. And then you've got voters, right? So this, sort of thinking about the times when I've tried to run a really down the middle email fundraising campaign. It doesn't raise as much money as the
Right.
hyperbolic stuff that everyone says, oh,
Right.
how does that work? So getting volunteers to organize and care about long-term political power is really, really tough. It's hard to
Yeah.
measure, and it takes lots of time. And that's just one example. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, what responsibilities do the voters have with respect to the quality of campaigns that they receive or engage with?
That's a great question. And I think, just to be clear, I don't disagree at all that all of those constraints make it really hard to do some of the things that I would like to
Mm-hmm.
see happen. I think it's possible to do more. In terms of the voters, there's a book I really like by Eaton Hirsch called Politics is for
Mm-hmm.
Power. He has a critique of how a certain set of voters, the people who are paying the most attention to politics, tend to engage. And he calls it political
Mm-hmm.
hobbyism, right? A lot of people who think of themselves as good citizens who pay a lot of attention, etc., what they actually do is, listen to a lot of political news, express opinions on social media or among their friends, read the newspaper, etc., etc. What they don't do is try to build long-term political power, as you just said. What they don't do is, volunteer year-round for political organizations or try to get involved with them in a deeper way. So I think for the people who care about politics, figuring out how to channel that care into things that actually matter rather than things that are just sort of, in some sense, being part of the performance that is the political world.
It's sort of like
It
cosplay
would,
almost.
yeah, it really is. I mean, you see it on Twitter all the time. There's people with, passionate opinions about what the Democratic Party is doing wrong or what the Republican Party is doing wrong. In my world, it's mostly the Democratic
Mm-hmm.
Party. Um, but they're not, so far as I can tell, many of them are not, joining their local party committee or joining any other grassroots political organization that's trying to move the party in the direction they'd like to see it move, or, doing their own campaigning of any sort, right? They're mostly grumping on Twitter. And so, yeah, cosplay is a great word for it. Now, that's not all of the people doing that, but it's certainly a substantial portion of them.
One of the things, again, talking about unintended consequences, you may know this study off the top of your head, but essentially it looked at the post Watergate reforms that led to more primaries, where direct nomination of candidates actually rearrange the incentive structure just for ideologues, right? Because
Right.
previously there may have been a patronage system, right, where your job is dependent on this person getting elected to this office, and so you had kind of a more moderating effect. And so if you take that incentive away from most voters, then it's just the ideologues, shall we call them, or the people increasingly who consume politics as entertainment to be involved.
And that is one thing that produces, I think, increasing polarization and separation between the parties and increasingly extreme candidates. Now, the evidence is most of the sort of increasing extremity and polarization is on the right, and it's not symmetrical, but it's certainly a mechanism that works across
Mm-hmm.
the board.
All right, Daniel, we're just a few weeks away from Election Day. What are some practical steps that a campaign could take to benefit from the findings in your book?
The short answer is I think the balance of spending on field versus everything else is basically inverted from where it ought to be. If I were in charge, and again, I'd rather the Democrats do this, but if I were in charge, really, I think for the good of democracy, though, every campaign would spend a lot more time just talking to regular people, having field people who it's their full-time paid job to go and get to know our community. Even, I mean, you said it's just a few weeks away. I know it's starting to ramp up, but we do have 2.5 months or so before the election. Listening, not just sort of knocking on doors and saying, "Hey, vote for my candidate," but asking people, what do they care about? What do they want to know? What do they want to see happen? What are the issues that really concern them? And being able to say to them, "I'll take that to the candidate. I'll take that to the party." Having real conversations with people and not just sort of reading from scripts, I think would make a huge difference in how connected people feel to politics. So many people, so many people hear nothing from any party or campaign, even people in swing states, if they're not people who voted hardly at all, for example. So I think doing more of that could make a real difference, and all the evidence shows that it's one of the few things that we could point to and say, the more people you talk to, not necessarily the more times you talk to them, but the more people you talk to, the greater the chance that you'll have more turnout.
So it sounds like a big endorsement for deep canvassing and relational organizing, and maybe some vote tripling. So things that we've all covered on the podcast, but also require time and investment from grassroots. So with that, I want to say thank you, Daniel, for joining us. This was a great conversation. I really enjoyed your book. It's called Producing Politics Inside the Exclusive Campaign World, where the privileged few shape politics for all of us. There's a link to buy it in the show notes. It's worth your time. It's a good read. And remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you learned something today, it made you a little bit smarter, share it with a friend. You'll also look smarter in the process. So with that, I want to say thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.